does the Simon Clarke intervention, he called on Rishi Sunak to go and he basically said the Tories are doomed if we don't change leader. Is that a kind of a herald of things to come? And it's interesting, isn't it? These coups, when these attempted coups, do they signal the beginning of a big upheaval, or do they fizzle out? There are lots of different examples, aren't there, through history?
Well, I was thinking about coups I've seen as I was travelling in this morning, and it felt to me like there's three categories. There's the coups which clearly work and remove the leader, and there's a change. There's the coups which clearly fail and actually end up with the person being challenged, ends up stronger rather than weaker as a result. And then there's the ones where, although it looks like they're failing, actually they weaken the Prime Minister, the incumbent, and in the end, people look back and say that was the moment. And on the first category, the Conservatives are always better at this. I mean, Tory coups tend to work, don't they? If you think, the strike of Michael Heseltine against Margaret Thatcher, if you think of the coup against Boris Johnson, the coup against Ian Duncan Smith when he was leader of the opposition. I mean, the Conservatives are good at coups.
Well, of course, Margaret Thatcher, the great hero of the Conservative movement, came to office as a result of a coup against Ted Heath. But then she was famously brought down, not just by Heseltine, but by the man who had been her Chancellor and Foreign Secretary, Geoffrey Howe. And he did this famous intervention in the House of Commons.
He had gone to a European negotiation to negotiate, and Margaret Thatcher had undercut them.
And that led to Heseltine challenging and her departure, but ultimately John Major becoming the Prime Minister. So yes, these coups can succeed, and the most spectacular recent example of that is Boris Johnson, who looked unassailable, to use a great political word, which is normally used when you're about to come a cropper. He had a big majority, he had won Brexit, and then he falls as a result of a coup that was initiated by Rishi Sunak's resignation and Sajid Javid's resignation from the cabinet on the same day.
And that's a key thing, isn't it? If you think about the coup against Thatcher, the coup against Johnson, actually the IDS one as well, very senior ministers or shadow ministers in the government or the shadow government wielded the knife. I mean, Simon Clarke is not one of those. He's not a senior part of Rishi Sunak.
But it doesn't have to be. I mean, I was a backbench MP when Ian Duncan Smith fell. And in fact, I was one of a team who used to brief Ian Duncan Smith every morning for Prime Minister's questions every Wednesday morning. And the team was me, Boris Johnson and David Cameron.
Oh, were you behind the coup against IDS?
I was not very...
you mean the team...
We were the PMQs team,
Oh,
plus Paul Goodman, who later left Parliament. And we
So you weren't behind the coup against IDS?
I was not behind the coup against IDS. But we did have a discussion, the three of us, David, Boris and me, we new MPs, like how are we going to vote in this confidence motion that had been called as a result of Ian's leadership. And we all agreed, look, that we worked with Ian, the Tory party was going nowhere under his leadership, so we'd all vote against him. So it gets to the day, I go and cast my vote as an MP in a secret ballot. And then the Deputy Chief Whip approaches me, because at this point the whips are have told Ian Duncan Smith he has to go and he's refused. And Deputy Chief Whip says, Boris Johnson hasn't voted, find him. So I run off and find Boris Johnson leaving Parliament. I said, I've got to go and edit The Spectator. I haven't got time to vote. I said, what do you mean you haven't got time to vote in the Tory leadership contest today? Anyway, so Boris went back and he voted against him. And then we all got together later that evening, David, me and Boris, and we all said, well, that was quite hard to do, but it's probably the right thing for the party. And David said, well, actually, I got a bit of a confession. I voted to keep him.
David Cameron voted to keep IDS.
I said, you promised us we were all going to vote against him. And he said, yeah, I don't think we should set a precedent that Tory leaders should be deposed. He said, I'm thinking ahead. And at that point, the penny dropped with me. I'm like, oh, yeah, David's maybe got a bit more of a strategic view of his career than I have at the moment.
But it worked. So despite the best efforts of David Cameron, it still succeeded.
It still worked. So that was a coup that succeeded in opposition. Then there are coups that clearly fail, aren't there?
Well, a classic recent example of that is the coup against Jeremy Corbyn in 2016, led by Hilary Benn, but there was a lot of shadow ministers resigned. But it didn't work. And Jeremy Corbyn stayed as leader. He went on to fight 2 more general elections. And in a way, what happened was that once this sort of sense of kind of collective loyalty and the broad church was broken by the coup, it was much easier for him then to become Jeremy Corbyn. He didn't have to kind of to have a shadow cabinet which was sort of reflective of the wider party, and he doubled down on being Jeremy Corbyn. And, I think in retrospect, that was a disastrous coup, which made things much, much worse for the coup people.
What about the ones against Gordon in the run-up to the 2010 election? There was James Pennell resigning, which was pretty dramatic, wasn't it?
2009, June or July?
I can't remember. I actually found out about it as Shadow Chancellor about a day beforehand. And
what?
We were told.
You're joking.
I
knew an hour before.
My secret sources told me that both David Miliband and James Purnell were going to resign.
No.
And then when it came to the 10 o'clock, we were all ready for, in the
Who
Conservative
told
opposition.
you?
Well, another little birdie. I can't.
How many
even
little birdies?
Even these years on, I can't tell you that.
Was it a Conservative who told you?
It wasn't. There certainly wasn't a Conservative. They wouldn't know.
Was it somebody who had in the past been connected to the Labour government?
It was someone who knew about what was going on, obviously. And
it was somebody who had previously served.
It's not like it's not the court of law.
I knew you'd stop me in the end, but I thought I might as well carry on.
Anyway, we knew before Gordon Brown knew, and then but then, of course Miliband didn't resign, did he? No. And which maybe was a big sliding door moment in David Miliband's career. And then there was the Jeff Hoon.
But it stopped me being Chancellor of the Exchequer. When I was travelling down on the train,
doesn't
get a call.
Rankle even to this day?
No, because by that time I didn't want to be Chancellor of the Exchequer. I was the education secretary. No, at that point,
someone record that.
No, I'm not. I'd said to Gordon and anybody who'd listened in the days before, this is a crazy idea. The idea that at this stage you'd remove Alistair Darling forcibly and put me in was mad. It would have been unbelievably divisive, but it's what Gordon wanted. Peter Mandelson saw Alistair to ask him whether he would take another job, and Alistair said no, he would just go to the backbenchers. But this was in train, and then James Pennell launches this exocet, and the one thing it did was absolutely stop. I found out on the Today programme the next morning I wasn't becoming Chancellor because it was announced Alistair Darling was staying as Chancellor. But
so that's a failed coup. Perhaps Simon Clarke is an example of a coup that appears to fail, well, but does, actually it sort of sets off a train of events that leads ultimately to someone being deposed. Sure. And there's kind of examples of that. There's back in the Mr. Time, Anthony Mayer was a backbench Tory MP who stood against Margaret Thatcher. Everyone thought that was ridiculous, but it did in fact set in train the events we were just talking about earlier. And then there was Tom Watson, the kind of junior Labour, I think he was a minister or something, was he? And it was it was called the Curry House plot. Him and a couple of other junior Labour MPs sitting in a curry house in Wolverhampton, Belash Curry House, which I actually subsequently visited, not coincidentally. And he said that Tony Blair had to go and step down and be replaced by Gordon Brown. It was seen off, but then a few days later, Blair actually did announce he was going to resign a year later. So what about that? That's an example, isn't it?
I think that both...
You knew about that, come on.
Both Anthony Mayer in 1989 and Tom Watson in 2006 are both examples of a coup which looks like it's failed.
So come back to today. I love all that. That's a really interesting piece of...
We could talk about this for hours. Which category does Simon Clarke go in? Success? So you've got definitely not success.
It feels like it's going to fail. It feels like we're way too close to an election. Let me be absolutely clear. I think it would be a huge mistake to replace Rishi Sunak, who's brought order and sense after years of chaos.
Isn't there a counter-argument?
To the leadership of the Tory party. But it's
They're
interesting...
behind in the polls. They need some change. They need something which gives them some new momentum, some new interest. It worked for John Major taking over for Margaret Thatcher in the 92 election. Is it impossible as an idea?
The idea that you provide within your party the change that the country wants is a classic Conservative trick. And in fact, the Conservatives are usually better at it than Labour because Labour is too tribal and sticks with its leaders even when they're not succeeding. I just don't think it would work today because A, there's not an obvious alternative who would be any better than Rishi Sunak. And B, the Conservatives already pulled this trick off several times in the last several years. So to try and persuade the country that yet another Tory Prime Minister is the solution to their problems, I just don't think really works. Nevertheless, there will be many Tory MPs who are facing unemployment later this year. And what emerges inside a parliamentary party as they're staring at defeat is quite a division between those sitting on very safe seats who go, okay, well, going into opposition, we've been in office for 14 years and, maybe that's the way things should be, or going to be anyway. And those who say, yeah, it's all right for you, I am about to lose my constituency and I lose my job and lose the career I love, and I want to do something about it. So the only leadership strategy that works in the Tory party is having a poll lead. The only thing that works as a unifying strategy is the promise that you might win the election. And you can announce any amount of policy, you can make any amount of promises to the Conservative Party. If you don't look like you're going to win, you're going to have huge leadership problems. And I think this is a sign of that. Simon Clarke's intervention is a sign that the party is not persuaded, partly because of this opinion poll funded by the Conservative Britain Alliance, by who we don't know. The Conservative Party at the moment thinks it's going to lose, and that is very destabilising for the leadership.